Hello everybody, welcome back to Off Meta Musings. I'm your host Aitan, and today I've got a bit of a tactics video for you. This entire video actually, it really came out of one idea, and that idea is that Warcry as a game is played over 4 turns. So your average fighter is only going to get 4 activations throughout an entire game. And the idea is if you have these very expensive fighters, or even cheap fighters, it doesn't really matter, who are only going to get to activate 4 times, how do you best make use out of those activations? And what are you going to be doing during your game in order to make sure that you can really eke out every small piece of value that you can out of the fighters that you're buying? And that's where this idea of efficiency has come from. How to play more efficiently. Some players might call it not misplaying, but a misplay during a game is a point of contention if it was a misplay or not. I mean, you can only really see these things in hindsight. But I'm talking about how you can kind of plan your turns a little bit better, plan your games a little bit better in your lists in order to really try and maximize the value that you're getting out of your units. Okay, so I've showed you this before. This is from my video on effective list building, the different kind of things that you want to take into account when you're actually doing it. And I'll put the link to this video up in the description below. But the thing that I want to remind you about is that when you're looking at trying to get the maximum amount of use out of your fighters, there are a few things that you really want to remember. One is going to be the missions. So bringing fighters that will complement your strategy to complete the missions that you're going to be playing. So maybe you're playing in a tournament and you know you're going to need a lot of chaff fighters, for example, then that's what you want to be bringing, as opposed to other fighters who essentially might be wasting their time during the game. And also making sure that you have a clear role and an idea what each of your fighters is going to be doing. And this really all comes into list building. Some people have said that the bulk of the tactics and strategy in Warcry comes from these kinds of things that happen pre-game. So the thought that you put into your list and how to build it. And I think that's a very valid point that they're making. Talking a little bit more about building for missions, yes, it is important that not all missions are actually created equal. Of course, different mission packs will have different building requirements, so I've talked a little bit about this already. So the Rumble pack favors higher model count lists because it has a lot of high objective count. So really try and think about what you're taking and what roles you're going to be assigning to each fighter. Your deployment groups are also decided before the game starts, so try to split your warband depending on what missions you expect to play. So for example, if you're playing the Rumble pack, loot and pillage does exist, so if you can get a fast objective carrier, maybe a teleporter in your hammer, you'll be in a pretty good stead to go and steal your opponent's treasure and try and get away with it and win the game that way. But if you're playing the match play missions, you want the same kind of thing, but in your dagger, because just of the way that those missions are set out. So here I've got a little selection on dice economy. It basically shows the probabilities of every single roll that you could make whilst rolling for your ability dice. So you'll see that around about a third of the time, you're going to be rolling 2 doubles and 2 singles, 1 double and 4 singles 23% of the time, a triple and 3 15% of the time, etc. What this does tell you is that on average, with your wild dice, you'll be able to get a triple, a double, and 2 singles most of the time during your games. But let's say you do roll that triple, do you use your wild dice to make your quad? And it depends really. Just because you can make a quad, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should. If you think about the abilities that you have access to and the dice that you'll need during a turn, it may be a question of actually just saving your dice and using your triple, especially if it's in the earlier turns of the game where there's not an amazing amount of action actually happening. Yeah, maybe you save your dice and then use it in later turns where it can be more impactful. One thing you do want to think about is the abilities you have access to and what dice you're going to need. So on average, like I've said, you will be looking at probably a couple of doubles and a couple of singles. So going back to list building, building around impactful quads might not actually be the best idea. Doubles are easiest to build around, followed by generic triples, and then triples that require high dice values, So if you have a plan for the abilities that you're going to be using during a game, you can really funnel your wild dice into what you actually need to be most effective. Here I've got something that's going to be fairly familiar to people already. It's straight out of the rulebook, but it really highlights the idea that I'm going for. Like I said already, Warcry is a game of 4 turns, so it means there are only so many activations that a fighter can make during that game. So ideally you want to maximize the impact your fighter has in your game, so you're not going to be wasting actions and wasting activations. Something that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of slides is when to activate your fighters, when to activate abilities, when to use actions, both within that fighter's activation window and in the context of your turn itself. Just as a quick reminder, your fighter has your 2 actions, and it can use an ability either before or after it uses any of those actions. And you're going to be alternating during the turn between your fighter and your opponent's fighters. Now, what this means is that during your turn, you want to make best use out of your actions whilst making it difficult for your opponent to make the best use of theirs. You'll see this in competitive list building, especially in things like the Rumble Pack, where most warbands will have a number of throwaway fighters, or chaff fighters as they're called, which you'll be able to activate earlier in the round or in between other fighters to try and burn opponent activations so that you'll effectively be able to see what your opponent's going to be doing. Commonly, this is referred to the activation wars, and it's really rooted in the idea that if your opponent doesn't have that many activations left, you can almost waste their time to effectively give you free reign over the board with your fighters. Now, I think the most valuable tool that you have here is the use of the wait action. What wait does is it's effectively a pass on that fighter's activation, and if you use it in your first action, you're allowed to reactivate the same fighter later on in the turn and use up your second action. So it really allows you to stretch out the amount of activations that you're going to be getting to kind of waste your opponents. To give an example, let's say you've got an expensive fighter, maybe it's a Varangard, maybe it's an Achelian King, maybe it's a Thundercat, that kind of thing. You bought it really to kill things. Any turn where that fighter is not killing things, any action where that fighter is not getting into position to kill things, the turn that that fighter takes to get into the fight or runs in and fails to kill what it's pointed at, effectively wastes a future action that you could otherwise be using to do other things. So, linked to this, of course, is the idea that different fighters want to be used at different times, depending on their roles and abilities. So really the only takeaway is plan your turns, think about what you want to do and how you're going to do it. Talking about abilities, we've got ability timing. Different abilities want to be used at different times during the turn and also within the activations of your fighters themselves. The abilities you're going to use are going to be dependent on if you have 1 or 2 attacks. So for example, let's say you're fighting in combat, you did a move to get in there, you've only got 1 attack to use, and you might have a number of different abilities that you can use. And the abilities you're going to use are going to be dependent if you've got 1 or 2 attacks. Some abilities will flat out give you more damage if you're only attacking once than a regular onslaught would if you manage to attack twice. Case in point would be the bloated ones with nets. If you only get to run in there and do 1 attack action, it's always going to be better to use your net because you get better damage outcomes than just by using onslaught. However, if you're already in a fight, then you can onslaught away to get 2 extra bonus attacks over your round and really try and kill what it is that you're fighting. You've got buff and debuff abilities. Generally, they want to be used early in the turn for the most impact. I've got an example for you. Let's say you're playing Kharadron Overlords and you want to use Fight for Profit to boost the attacks of your Thunderers. To maximize the damage of Fight for Profit, you really want to be near an objective. So in the early turns especially, it will normally take your character a turn to get in range of the objective in the first place. And your Thunderers are going to take a turn to get in range of the character who's near the objective, with normally 1 round of shooting. So the main bulk of the damage is actually done later in the turn, which gives opponents time to get into position for an attack on either the character or the Thunderers themselves. And of course, this works the other way around. If you can see that your opponent is trying to get into position to do things, you do normally have a couple of activations in order to try and either stop them from doing it or lessen the damage that's going to be done. Probably the most common example of abilities being used at different times is the Rampage Quad. So the Rampage Quad is a bonus move action and then a bonus attack. And when you want to use Rampage will really depend on the situation of your fighter. If the fighter is not in combat yet, then you can use Rampage first, get the most out of your bonus move, then you can attack again, and then you've got one additional action to do things. Or if you're already engaged, you want to save Rampage for the end of your fighter's activation. So attack in order to kill whatever it is you're in combat with, and then move, and then attack again with your free actions. The idea is that if you're only going to get 8 actions, anything you can do to either get more actions or maximize the effect of the actions that you already have is really going to go a long way. Linked to this is reactions. So a very quick refresher course in reactions. You can use them in your opponent's turn in response to an enemy fighter's activation. You've got your 3 universal reactions: counter, take cover, and strike them down. They can all be used at different times. The reaction that you're going to be making the most use out of in terms of universal reactions is going to be counter. I've played a bunch of games now. I've kind of never used take cover. I haven't had the opportunity to strike them down. The reason for this is because using a reaction takes up one of the actions that your fighters are going to be able to use themselves during the turn. So when talking about playing efficiently, you really have to think about, is it worth me doing this reaction? And because of this, sometimes they are an overlooked mechanic in Warcry. Most of the time, they aren't better than that one action you're trading for them. And the requirement that the fighter has to have actions spare means that they're most likely not activated yet. Because of this, they only really see play in the event that you're almost 100% sure that your character is going to die in the attack that's coming in, with the exception of the really high impact reactions like Gloomspite Gits, which trades an action on one of your fighters for 3 additional actions for one of your other better fighters. But what you can do is use the threat of damage from your reactions to add pressure onto your opponent and force them into making moves that they might not otherwise make, especially with their weaker units. Eventually, you're actually going to have to do damage to fighters, either to push them off objectives, grab treasure, or clear out areas of the board. The amount of damage that you can do versus their remaining wounds is probably the most important thing in trying to maximize the amount of useful actions that your fighters have. Ideally, you want to knock out a fighter in one action because it would free up your second action to do something else. So abilities like Onslaught, Rampage, and the other damage or attack boost abilities really become valuable. Something that you can use in your first action to push up your damage and really knock out that fighter in one turn. If you don't manage to kill the opposing fighter and they're yet to activate, they'll have the opportunity to attack twice, potentially killing or injuring your fighter. And that's where you really want to be sure, if you can't knock out a fighter in one turn, try and charge fighters that have already activated, so that will protect you for the next turn and give you the opportunity for a double attack, possibly in following turns. That being said, the move attack action sequence is still a valuable tool to waste your opponent's actions, because what it can do is really lock down their fighters to stop them from being able to get into position to put their force to bear. This again has a bearing in the amount of fighters that you take and in your list building, so it's really something to think about. But the thing that I really want you to take from this is think about what's going to happen in the next turn. So if you're already engaged with a fighter at the end of your turn, you'll both have the opportunity to double attack next turn. This means normally that either one of your 2 fighters is going to be killed. But what it also means is that especially if your opponent fighter is going to have to use 2 actions in order to kill you, they're not going to be able to get into position in order to take objectives, in order to go grab treasure, in order to run away, that kind of thing. So there we go, that's really what I wanted to share with you guys today. Like I said before, it's not really a tactics video in so much as me saying, oh, you should do this and you should do that, get better at the game. More like, here's a few things to think about whilst you're playing your games, whilst you're list building, before the turn starts, before the battle even starts. And maybe it'll help you improve just a little bit and get more use out of your fighters while you're actually playing your games of Warcry. So yeah, that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching. If you want more stuff like this and you like what you saw, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know. Let me know any tactics that you may be using during your games, anything that you found be particularly useful to remember whilst you're playing, maybe during list building, and we can have a good talk about it. But like I said, that's it from me. Thank you very much, and I will see you next time.